All right. We're still in chapter 1 of Romans. I just put my shirt on. About out of coffee. That's bad. Okay. The next note is pretty offensive. Let's start with the verse 27. And likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burn in their lust one toward another, men with men, working that which is unseemly, and receiving in themselves that recompense of their error which was meet. Sexually transmitted diseases. Are you one of those people that think love is love? These are one of the verses that, like, it confronts you and asks the question, is love love? Or is your definition of love broken? That phrase, love is love, it's liberal Democrats, as I was saying earlier, they think that men being with men or women being with women, homosexuality, is that okay in the church? I think with verses like this, you can see that God is indicating that that is a sin. What is the natural use in verse 27? The natural thing is for me to be with a female. The problem is Satan has destroyed us on all fronts. He's attacked the culture, the mind, the education, the health, the mentality, the politics. He's hit us on everything. So even if there was a woman out there that wanted to be with me, then she would just be looking for a guy with a better job, better truck, and better pay, better house, and better stock portfolio, obviously. She'd be looking for all that. She gets me for a little while, but then she'd just dump me anyway because that's how it is. I guess that's how they're built. I don't know. But that's the culture. Is America is bigger and better, biggest and the best. Everybody wants Texas, but once everybody has Texas, then what about all the other states? They don't really just throw those out. So then everybody gets divorced and remarries and divorces and remarries. Nobody's ever satisfied because they're looking for something better. So there's no loyalty to your husband. There's no marriage solidification, or there's no done deal as far as marriage. Like my grandparents, their 50th anniversary. You think anybody lasts 50 years now? Does anybody stay together for 50 years? No, there's always some problem. They have kids and they decide, oh, I never wanted kids. And then she dumps him. Or, I lost my job, huh? I gotta take this bad job at this little store here. That job's not good enough. I'm dumping him, after 5 years. So, anyway, I'm not making excuses over the sin. I'm saying the natural use is for me to be with a woman and for the woman to be with a man. And since women are confused and men are confused, this is the kind of stuff that happens, We become corrupted by satanic, demonic perspectives, liberal, dumb perspectives that turn us on our heads and justify ungodly, evil behavior. And it's sad that this stuff happens, but it's an indicator of the end of the end. If men have realized now that women are just going to dump them, why should any man get married today? And why should they produce any kids if the woman's just going to abort the kids, or, that's horrible. Because then you feel responsible for that you created that new life, and then the woman is so selfish and greedy, and she goes and has the baby aborted without you even realizing it. Why should the man even pursue a woman today with how satanic and how screwed up all the women have become? It's kind of hopeless. But let's stick with the verse here. I need to get married, but you can't, indicator of the end, like I was saying. And if you were one of these people, it's not good. It's not natural, and you'll get health problems from doing this stuff. So it's good advice to stay away from this and to not become one of these people. But you also can't get married today. We're kind of between a rock and a hard place, aren't we? Alex, use dating websites. That's a bunch of that's all AI stuff. None of these women actually exist. Some guy from Ukraine trying to get me to spend $100 for some website membership, and then he just dangles the carrot right in my face of some lady that would be good, and then she doesn't even exist. She's just some creation of some idiot on a computer. It's pretty bad, our situation, men. So anyway, it's another indicator of the end of the dispensation. It ends in apostasy. And if people aren't making babies, there's no next generation. Or the generation that is being produced is so corrupt that they're going to create, the next generation is so crippled that society is ending. Like that's where we're at. Scary stuff, huh? I know maybe you have the perfect family and everything's fine with you. I'm saying overall in this country, you see the trends. It's hopeless for a single guy like me, Now, a miracle from God is possible, and the right woman for me could be right around the corner. Who knows? But that's His timing and how He wants to do it, and the right person for me, it's out of my hands. So, anyway, the point of the verse is stay away from homosexuality. What's the note? Pretty offensive note. I'll kind of bleep it out here. There is the natural use of women by straight, normal men. There is the unnatural use by, lots of offensive words here, homosexuals. And there is the supernatural, or what did he tell me? Sodomites. That's what I'm supposed to use. And there is the natural use by either the devil, e.g. Mary Magdalene, Luke 8:2, or God, Mary, the mother of Jesus, Luke 1:35. The same may be said of men. The reference in verses 26 through 27 is to the unnatural use by sex perverts. Homosexuals are sodomites. Part of the recompense that they earned by their lifestyle was gonorrhea, syphilis, and GRID, AIDS, HIV, and just as the number of venereal diseases, now called sexually transmitted diseases, went from 3 in the 1950s to 27 in the 1990s, you can expect bigger and better diseases in the future because of this sin. So ultimately, do I think, well, let's keep going. I really want to talk about this, but okay, he's got one more note on 28. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a reprobate mind to do those things which are not convenient. There's that word I wanted to get to. Okay, there's multiple notes here, so let's read them and think about it, and then come back to what I was thinking. Here's the first note. Here is the final warning against the Bible revisers in this chapter. The new corrupt Bibles have changed did not like to retain God in their knowledge to read did not acknowledge God any longer. Wow. Every one of these apostates acknowledge God, just like the devils, James 2:19. They just don't want to retain him in their knowledge when they sit down to corrupt what he said. That's a good point. Okay, there's another note. Some people use this verse to teach that God won't save homosexuals, but that isn't true. So this is what I was saying with Ruckman being kind of liberal. Okay, see 1 Corinthians 6, 9 through 11, and notice the effeminate and abusers of themselves with mankind in verse 6. The expression reprobate mind has nothing to do with anything that took place in Paul's day or ours. It is a reference to God giving up on the Gentiles back in Genesis 11, 1 through 9. Wow. Because you assume that, here's my perspective. So you notice what he said, right? Some people use this verse to teach that God won't save homosexuals, but that isn't true. God would save a homosexual? I think that, I don't know. What do you think? I think there are verses that are speaking against it, and other verses that show how merciful and loving God is. I go back to what J. Vernon McGee said years ago, is living in the pig pen versus falling in the pig pen, you know? Just because homosexuality is a horrible sin doesn't mean there aren't a lot of other horrible sins, you know. Fornication, having sex outside of marriage, you know, you could argue that's just as bad, really. Maybe some people might disagree on that, but sin, all unrighteousness. What did we say earlier? All unrighteousness. So anyway, what J. Vernon McGee was saying years ago was that the prodigal son, even though he may slip into the pig pen and fall into sin, doesn't mean he can't choose to get out of the pig pen and start walking with God and serving God and being obedient to God? Or is it a lifestyle of sin and being against God, you know? That's what I think anyway. So if a person that is a practicing homosexual recognizes that his behavior is sin and decides to turn away from it and go to Christ, even though maybe he's still struggling with it or something, you know, but maybe he recognizes it is sin and he starts to see that's. So I don't know if I agree with him on some of this. He has a lot of good points about Bible corruptors, but is a homosexual going to be saved if they're still a homosexual, you know? Well, prostitute still a prostitute, or a gambling rapist is still a gambling rapist, but do they turn away from it? That would be the question, you know? Or do they recognize that it is a sin? I think if they recognize it as a sin and they turn away from it and agree with God about it, about what it is, and ask God to help them overcome that sin, I think that's a totally different story versus somebody that is a homosexual, but they still call out to God. Well, if they call out to God before they die, I guess it's possible, but I don't know. But he's pointing out this about Genesis 11, 1 through 9, giving up on the Gentiles. So he's thinking about it dispensationally rather than thinking about it having to do with sin or salvation. Well, they're related, I guess. So he has one more note here to think about, and then we'll close. I don't know if maybe I think this might be all I'm going to get to today. It's a lot to think about. Because I'm thinking about a repentant person, and overall what it's describing here in chapter 1, it sounds a lot worse. But then how chapter 2 starts, he's saying everybody's looped into that anyway. So this is tough. This is tough stuff. Do I lean toward homosexuals not saved? Yeah, that's what I've always thought, you know. But our culture will promote just fornication everywhere in everything, you know. And then the homosexual is blacklisted when the fornicator is doing this, you know, just as bad unrighteousness. So shouldn't be disregarded, or we need to think about this. So he's got one more paragraph here talking about this word reprobate. So let's continue. The word reprobate doesn't mean lost with no chance of salvation. As Calvin taught, anybody can fit the description of a reprobate in verses 29 through 39. See John 3:36. Verses 29 through 39. What does he mean there? Is that a typo? There aren't 39 verses there. Oh, maybe, no. Well, okay. Of a reprobate in verses 29 through 39, see John 3:36. Reprobate means to put on probation again, i.e., to be tested by God and fail that at least twice. God tested the Gentiles on the things listed in verses 29 through 32, and they failed in Genesis 6 and 11. God gave up on them and stopped dealing with them as a whole. That is why Genesis 12 takes up the narrative of Abraham and the fathers of the nation of Israel. A similar thing took place with the Jews in the book of Acts. See note on Acts 13:46. According to Acts 17:30, the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ changed the status of the Gentiles in that regard. You are living in the day where God is presently dumping the Gentiles again to deal with Israel nationally. Romans 11:21 through 27. So he's really focused on dispensational thinking here, but reprobate means to put on probation again, to be tested by God and fail that test at least twice. Reprobate mind. So let's say you agree with God and you turn away from some sin, and then maybe years later you fall back into it, you know? Do we all fit the description of a reprobate mind? What if the homosexual turns away from his sin and recognizes it as sin, and then he returns back to it a year later, you know, and is ashamed of himself and everything? Do we all meet that description of reprobate mind? I don't know. The way this guy was talking to me yesterday about that word, he was focused on, that's what I tend to think about, is what J. Vernon McGee said years ago about lifestyle. Living in a behavior or a sin, lifestyle, you live in it. It's a part of you. Sin all the time, every day, versus you fall into a sin, but you get out. He pulls you out of the sin, and you turn away from it, and you go along your way with Jesus Christ. So that's how I'm thinking about it, but I don't know. This is very difficult for me, and I lean toward the conservative perspective, and I think, well, see, I'm back and forth about it. Guess I'm a reprobate mind. Maybe we should just try to be obedient to God and turn away from all of our sin and be obedient to Him, which I think he's going to get to that soon in these notes. He does say something like that should be our goal in life. Because go back to 27. You live in that lifestyle, then receive in themselves that recompense of their error, which was meat. When you live in that lifestyle, you reap what you sow, and you get all these sexually transmitted diseases and probably all kinds of other problems. So that makes sense. Maybe it's the same idea with literally every other sin in our lives. You know, it has different effects on us, long-term, short-term effects. The more obedient we are to Him, the less we're going to have to deal with those problems, and the better life we're going to lead, and the more He can bless us. But when we live in these lifestyles, we reap what we sow. But about the question of salvation, even if anybody, no matter who they are, no matter what they've done, if they can call out to Christ, that makes sense. I mean, even in the last moment, is it possible? Anything's possible. And He is so merciful. A lot to think about. Okay, we did it! We finished chapter 1! But let's keep talking about it in the comments, because this is difficult. So, thank you. Goodbye.